October 18th, 1944. Hollandia, Dutch, New Guinea. The heat in the bamboo-walled hut settled on Lieutenant Kenji Inoue like a physical weight as he sat at the rough wooden table, bare feet on the packed earth, the sour smell of sweat and damp khaki hanging in the still air. He had been an officer of the Imperial Japanese Army, educated, proud, raised on schoolroom portraits of the emperor and classroom lessons that promised death before capture. Now he was a prisoner, thin but unharmed, guarded by men who offered him cigarettes and called him lieutenant, as if nothing had broken. On the table in front of him lay a sheet of paper covered in carefully inked Japanese characters, drafted by Allied translators, an English version beside it in block capitals, a promise of decent treatment for any Japanese soldier who surrendered, a safe conduct pass to be dropped by the hundreds of thousands over jungle ridges and coral beaches. The English said simply that any bearer was to be treated under the Geneva Convention. The Japanese version said, in clear black strokes, "I surrender." Inoue read it twice, his fingertips resting on the paper, and felt his jaw tighten. He could see in his mind the men he had commanded at Buna and Salamaua, boys from Ehime and Osaka, clutching such a leaflet while American shells crashed around them. He could hear the political officers, the regimental sermons, the angry bark of instructors insisting that surrender was worse than death, that the captured man doomed his family to shame. He knew to the bone that no Japanese soldier who still breathed and loaded his rifle would carry a card that began with those two characters. For a moment he was back on the northern coast of New Guinea in 1943, half-starved, malaria shaking his bones, watching his battalion shattered by artillery they could not answer. He remembered the moment he collapsed by a stream, too weak to move, expecting a bayonet, and instead receiving clean water from a canteen with an American hand. It was the first fracture in the story he had believed. Now this leaflet was another. He looked up at the American psychological warfare officer and the Nisei linguist waiting silently across from him and, in careful English, said the first words that would make his own war obsolete. "If you write it like this, no one will use it." Outside that hut, the war in the Pacific had reached a turning point that gave weight to every line of text these men were arguing over. Japan had surged across Asia in 1941 and 1942, taking prisoners by the tens of thousands from Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Netherlands East Indies, but it had very few prisoners of its own men. By mid-1944, United States planners counted Japanese prisoners in the low tens of thousands across all theaters, a trivial fraction of the hundreds of thousands killed in place. On Saipan, out of more than 30,000 Japanese defenders, only around 900 survived to be taken alive. On Biak, on Peleliu, on New Guinea, the pattern repeated. Banzai charges that ended in fields of bodies, isolated soldiers choosing suicide or mutual death with grenades rather than raise their hands. Allied intelligence, reading captured documents and listening to the first serious interrogations, understood why. Instruction manuals and field codes drummed in the same message: never fall into enemy hands. Never allow your body to be captured. Death is a duty superior to life. Families of prisoners risked stigma at home. In this context, early Allied attempts at surrender leaflets were almost useless. Printed in millions, they spoke of surrender in the direct language that had worked in Europe, where the German soldier might still weigh survival against defeat. In the Pacific, those same words were poison. Reports from the front described leaflets ignored or used as toilet paper, few, if any, carried into Allied lines. At the same time, the scale of Allied production was staggering. Psychological Warfare Branch and associated units in the Southwest Pacific printed millions of leaflets each month, loaded them into bombers, artillery shells, and mortars. They had aircraft, ink, paper, translators, loudspeakers, and portable presses, all fed by an industrial system that produced cargo ships in their thousands and ammunition by the tens of millions. There was no shortage of ways to speak. The problem was finding words that Japanese soldiers could accept without feeling they had cut their own souls loose. This problem reached Hollandia in the person of Lieutenant Inoue that afternoon. Inoue lowered his eyes again to the Japanese characters written by the Allied staff and pointed with the bony finger at the first two, the characters that declared total defeat of self. He spoke softly in Japanese first, then repeated in English for the Americans. The Nisei linguist, born in California to parents now in a camp in Utah, nodded as he translated. Inoue explained that for men raised on the 1941 Imperial Rescript to soldiers and sailors, for boys who had recited in school that captivity meant the collapse of family honor, the phrase on the leaflet was not an invitation to life, but a command to die. He thought of a note he had once written to his younger brother in Ehime, telling him that if he ever heard Inoue had been captured, he should consider his brother already dead. Now he said aloud, to the surprise of the room, that he had been wrong. He admitted he had been captured, that his captors had not tortured him, that he had seen American medical orderlies treat Japanese wounds with the same care as their own. He hesitated, tasting the risk in his own words. Others had begun to say such things too. In Allied reports collected later, one Japanese prisoner described his capture as a kind of rebirth. Another wrote that, once he understood he would live, he felt as though he had died as a soldier and awakened as a human being. Inoue did not yet think in those phrases, but he felt their outline as he leaned over the paper and said in Japanese, "Write it as I cease resistance, or I will stop fighting." These words, he told them, offered a thin bridge between the old code and the new reality. A man could cease resistance in order to save his unit, his family, his emperor, even while telling himself he had not accepted shameful surrender. The Nisei linguist added that the verbs must be precise, the honorifics respectful, the tone dignified rather than pleading. The American captain listened, pencil poised, as three worlds met across that table. An Imperial officer taught to die, an American officer with access to ships and presses beyond counting, and a Nisei translator translating not just language but honor. Inoue understood that other prisoners had refused to help with propaganda, fearing retribution after the war. He felt that fear, too. Yet he also remembered half-delirious Japanese boys dying in the jungle mud while shouting empty slogans. If this card could bring even a few out alive, it might be worth whatever judgment awaited him. Within a few hours, that hut in Hollandia had produced a revised text that drew directly on Inoue's advice and on similar comments from other cooperative prisoners in the theater, and drafts went out along the chain of command. The new safe conduct passes that followed carried phrases like, "I cease resistance" in Japanese, wording that careful studies and interrogations had shown would not strike so directly at the heart of Bushido teachings. Some versions displayed photographs of captured Japanese soldiers in clean uniforms, smoking, eating, speaking with American or Australian guards, visual proof that the enemy did not always abuse those who laid down arms. Allied production facilities in the Southwest Pacific and in Australia, already turning out millions of psychological leaflets each month, adapted with ease. By late 1944 and early 1945, millions of the revised passes were falling through the air over Leyte, Luzon, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and countless smaller islands. American and Australian officers in the field began to report a slow but measurable change. Small groups came in waving leaflets above their heads. Isolated men crawled toward lines at night, clutching the cards like talismans, calling in hoarse Japanese that they had ceased resistance. Each such crossing represented not only one life saved, but a tiny fracture in a wartime culture that had equated survival with disgrace. From a historical distance, the scene in that Hollandia hut might seem minor beside the thunder of carrier task forces, the eruption of B-29 firebombing raids, or the final atomic blasts that crushed Japanese cities in 1945. Yet the language shift was not cosmetic. It had been given by prisoners who had once sworn never to live in enemy hands, and it created a concept through which Japanese soldiers could step out of a war their leaders still demanded they die for. In that sense, in one hot afternoon, men like Lieutenant Inoue began to help write a path that made their own war, as they had been taught to understand it, obsolete. The change did not end the fighting, and fanatic resistance would continue with terrible ferocity. But from this point forward, the Allied psychological war in the Pacific had a weapon it had lacked before. Japanese prisoners who, by reshaping a few words, turned absolute death promises into negotiable choices. Their story, and Inoue's, would continue to unfold as the battles moved closer to Japan itself. The monsoon rains came early that November, hammering the roofs of the Allied camps at Hollandia, until mud oozed between the rows of tents and diesel water shimmered around the supply dumps. Lieutenant Kenji Inoue had been transferred to the compound for cooperative prisoners, where Allied intelligence officers questioned and studied those willing to talk. Barbed wire surrounded the perimeter, but within, the camp bore little resemblance to the fearsome cages Japanese soldiers imagined. Prisoners walked freely inside the fence, building bamboo shelters, tending small gardens, or repairing clothing under the supervision of military police who spoke with weary patience rather than menace. Inoue had been assigned to the Nisei section, a group of Japanese-speaking Americans who interviewed captives and translated captured diaries. Each day began at dawn with roll call, a breakfast of rice or tinned meat, and hours spent reviewing captured documents under the canvas roof of an interrogation hut that smelled faintly of damp paper and kerosene lamps. Inoue worked beside a man from California named Sergeant Hiroshi Kondo, whose parents had been born in Osaka, but who now wore the uniform of the United States Army. Between them, the air was heavy with irony neither dared speak aloud. Kondo's family lived behind barbed wire in Utah. Inoue's wife, if she lived, was in a burned-out district of Osaka. Yet they shared the slow rhythm of translation, the rustle of paper, the pauses as they searched for the right nuance between two languages that had once defined enemy and ally. Beyond the camp, the Allied front moved westward across the Pacific with a scale of machinery that defied imagination. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur had landed at Leyte on October 20, 1944, with nearly 700 ships and 200,000 men, the largest amphibious assault yet seen in the Pacific. Overhead, B-24 Liberators thundered daily from bases in New Guinea to soften Japanese airfields and railways. On the sea, the Battle of Leyte Gulf unfolded in late October, where 4 Japanese carriers, 9 battleships, and over 30 cruisers and destroyers clashed with the overwhelming mass of the U.S. 3rd and 7th Fleets. By the end of that battle, Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Nearly 300,000 tons of steel wiped from the ocean in 4 days. The Imperial Navy never recovered. Inoue read the reports in translation and felt a dull, detached sorrow, not for the Empire's loss, but for the men on those ships who had died believing they were defending a divine nation untouched by weakness. He understood now that Japan's war had been built on illusions, of limitless spirit defeating material power, of the Emperor's invincibility, of eternal glory in death. Yet here in Hollandia, he saw American convoys moving daily, trucks groaning with rations, cranes lifting crates of typewriters and medicines, and engineers building new airstrips faster than the jungle could swallow them. The Americans possessed not just weapons, but abundance. It was abundance that won wars. By December, Allied intelligence officers had realized that cooperative prisoners like Inoue could provide more than translations. They were living instruments of psychological warfare. The Americans studied every captured diary, every intercepted message, searching for cracks in Japanese morale. They noted that many soldiers feared starvation more than death, and that officers worried constantly about their families in Japan. They learned that soldiers hid photographs of wives and children sewn into uniform linings, and that hunger and homesickness eroded even the most hardened divisions. From these findings, the Psychological Warfare Division refined its message. Instead of promising comfort, leaflets now promised food, medicine, and a chance to see Japan again after the war. Inoue helped edit the Japanese phrasing to preserve dignity. One leaflet he worked on began, "To the brave sons of Japan who have ceased resistance, eat, rest, and live to rebuild your homeland." Another, distributed before the invasion of Luzon, displayed a color photograph of captured soldiers mending roads under American supervision, clean, fed, and smiling faintly. "They are alive," the caption read in Japanese. "You can be too." Inoue copied the characters by hand to ensure they carried the right balance of respect and persuasion. When the first aircraft dropped these new leaflets over the Philippine hills in January 1945, no one expected miracles. But within weeks, patrols began reporting Japanese stragglers surrendering in small numbers, some clutching the leaflets, others repeating the printed phrases, "Cease resistance," in broken English. The psychological front, invisible but vast, had begun to shift. Inside the camp, Inoue's days acquired a strange peace. He spent mornings translating captured orders or writing explanatory notes for Allied officers. Afternoons often brought discussions with visiting intelligence analysts who wanted to understand the Japanese mind. He tried to explain that the Army's fanaticism was not madness but training, a moral architecture built from childhood that collapsed only when reality provided no space left for it to stand. "If you show them that they can survive without shame," he said once through the translator, "some will listen. But you must let them keep a small piece of honor. Even one word can save that piece." The Americans nodded, scribbling notes. Outside, the sky turned copper at dusk, and from beyond the wire came the rhythmic sound of native laborers unloading supply crates at the docks. Inoue sometimes walked the perimeter after sunset, listening to the hum of generators and the far-off music from the enlisted men's canteen, a radio tune drifting through the night. He had once imagined that captivity meant silence and humiliation. Instead, it had become a place where words themselves could change the course of war. What he could not yet know was that his translations and quiet reasoning would ripple across thousands of miles of ocean, reaching Japanese soldiers still hidden in jungles, men who would carry the same leaflets into their final decisions. The seeds planted in that rainy camp at Hollandia were beginning to take root in the unlikeliest soil, the conscience of defeated men. By early 1945, the Allied tide had surged northward from the jungles of New Guinea to the Philippine archipelago, leaving the prisoner compounds at Hollandia far behind the front. Lieutenant Kenji Inoue was moved again, this time by C-47 transport to Leyte Island, where a new prisoner processing camp stood near Dulag, under rows of coconut palms and corrugated iron sheds. The flight itself was a revelation. Below him, as the transport crossed over the endless expanse of blue water dotted with supply ships, he saw a sight few Japanese officers ever imagined possible. Hundreds of gray hulls stretching from horizon to horizon. Tankers, troop ships, hospital ships, and the stubby silhouettes of destroyers escorting them. The convoy was a moving continent of steel, a visible measurement of industrial willpower. On deck after landing, Inoue counted 30 cranes unloading supplies, each hoisting crates marked rations, ammunition, and medical stores. American soldiers worked in shifts without pause, their movements directed by whistles and hand signals, as long chains of trucks carried the goods inland toward airfields and hospitals. He remembered Japanese supply lines at Buna, mules, handcarts, and exhausted men dragging rice sacks through mud. Here, cargo moved as if the earth itself cooperated. In that moment, Inoue understood the futility of Japan's belief that spirit could outweigh machinery. No spirit could conjure cranes from nothing or fuel endless columns of vehicles. When he wrote later in his diary, he described this day as the first time I saw the shape of defeat made visible not by battle, but by production. At Dulag, the prisoner camp mirrored the immense organization of the American war machine. Rows of neat barracks, electrified kitchens, medical wards with refrigerators humming under tropical heat. More than 10,000 prisoners passed through that facility by March 1945, processed, examined, and distributed to labor, detachments under rules that adhered, almost pedantically, to the Geneva Convention. Inoue, now recognized by the Americans for his linguistic precision and quiet authority, was assigned as an assistant interpreter under the psychological warfare branch attached to the 8th Army. His task was to review captured diaries and evaluate the mindset of Japanese survivors brought in from the hills. The stories were nearly identical: units starving, ammunition exhausted, commanders dead or suicided, survivors emaciated and bewildered. Many had seen their comrades blow themselves up with grenades to avoid capture. Yet here they stood, fed and clothed by the enemy they had been told would torture and kill them. Inoue spoke to them in their own dialects, softening their shame with simple truth. "You are soldiers," he said quietly. "You fought as soldiers. The war will end. To live is not dishonor." Some wept. Others remained silent. When reports of these interviews reached higher command, Allied officers realized they were witnessing the slow unraveling of an ideology. The act of surviving captivity was becoming thinkable. Beyond the wire, events moved faster than anyone had expected. In February 1945, American Marines assaulted Iwo Jima, a volcanic island defended by 21,000 Japanese soldiers. Only 216 were taken alive. In March, American B-29 bombers dropped nearly 2,000 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo in a single night, creating firestorms that killed over 100,000 civilians. These were numbers Inoue could scarcely comprehend. Cities reduced to ash in hours, entire populations burned beneath paper walls. Yet even as the home islands burned, the prisoner camps in the Philippines grew. Each week, transport trucks brought in survivors from remote jungle pockets. Some carried homemade white flags. Others stumbled in barefoot, clutching the surrender leaflets that Inoue had helped translate months earlier. Allied records later showed that by mid-1945, the number of Japanese prisoners in the Pacific had risen to over 130,000. Small compared to Germany's millions, but a transformation beyond any pre-war imagination. What had once been an unthinkable act of shame had become, for many, the only remaining act of will. Inoue spent those months between paperwork and reflection, his life suspended between two collapsing worlds. At night, from the open window of his quarters, he could hear distant artillery rumbling toward Luzon's northern hills, where the last Japanese divisions still fought under General Yamashita. Each explosion seemed to him a heartbeat of an empire dying by inches. In the compound hospital, he saw Japanese patients treated beside Filipino civilians, and even wounded American soldiers. Nurses moved from bed to bed without distinction. It was there, watching a wounded Japanese corporal and an American Marine share a cigarette, that Inoue finally understood how completely the old war had been undone. The ideology that had shaped his youth, the idea that nations could divide humanity into worthy and unworthy, conqueror and conquered, had already collapsed in practice even before Japan's formal surrender. Men who had once aimed rifles at each other shared medicine and water. And in that small daily cooperation, Inoue saw the proof that the war's machinery of hate had outlived its purpose. He would later write that this realization, not the atomic bombs or the surrender at Tokyo Bay, marked the true end of Japan's war. It ended the moment its soldiers began to live among their enemies and found they were human after all. April 1945, Luzon. The rainy season returned to the Philippines with a fury that turned the roads into rivers of clay, but the convoys moved regardless. Lieutenant Kenji Inoue rode in the back of a GMC truck with half a dozen American engineers and 2 other Japanese prisoners now employed as translators. Their destination was the Bilibid prison complex in Manila, once used by the Japanese Kempeitai, now converted into an Allied interrogation and rehabilitation center for thousands of captives coming down from the northern mountains. Manila itself was a vision of ruin. The battle that ended in March had destroyed what had once been called the Pearl of the Orient. Entire districts lay flattened, burned to ash and twisted steel. The Americans estimated over 100,000 civilians dead in 6 weeks of street fighting. The air still smelled of smoke and rot. As their truck passed along Dewey Boulevard, Inoue saw what war had done to both conqueror and conquered. American engineers rebuilt docks beside the skeletons of warehouses, while Filipino families dug through debris for scrap metal. Here was the truth behind the slogans that had sent millions of men marching. No emperor's glory, no liberation of Asia, just concrete dust and hunger. Yet in the middle of that wreckage, the Americans had set up feeding stations serving rice and soup to civilians and prisoners alike. Lines of people stretched down the street. Filipino, Chinese, Japanese, all carried tin bowls and stood together under the same rain. It was this equality of misery, Inoue thought, that began to dissolve the last illusions of superiority. At Bilibid, the processing yards teemed with prisoners who had filtered out of the mountains in groups of 20, 50, sometimes 100. Many arrived skeletal, wearing rags, barefoot, covered in sores. Allied medics weighed them, deloused them, gave them clean uniforms marked with large white PW letters. Inoue helped register each man, asking name, rank, hometown. Most bowed silently, avoiding his eyes. Some recognized him as an officer and snapped to attention before remembering they no longer served. The Americans were careful, strict, but not cruel. They fed each man rice, bread, meat, and vitamins, an impossible bounty to those who had eaten roots and bark for months. The first meal often brought tears. Inoue watched from the mess hall doorway as men who had sworn never to live in captivity now bent over plates, trembling with hunger and shame. He knew that this moment, the first bite of forbidden food, marked the true surrender of body and mind. It was not defeat through force, but through nourishment. He recalled his first meal in Allied hands, the bitter taste of coffee, and realized that the Americans had conquered more effectively with food than with fire. Later that month, Allied officers used Inoue and other cooperative prisoners to record radio broadcasts aimed at the holdouts still fighting in the Cordillera Mountains. The scripts were written carefully, balancing duty with survival. "To my comrades still in the hills," Inoue's voice said in flawless Japanese, "I have seen the truth of our situation. To live now is to serve Japan in the future. The war will end. Come down safely." These messages were transmitted nightly by shortwave, mixed with soft Japanese music, and the voices of other prisoners calling out names of old regiments. At first, only a handful responded. Then, as April turned to May, entire platoons began surrendering. The change was not universal. Some Japanese units fought to extinction, still clinging to orders from Tokyo that insisted surrender meant disgrace. General Tomoyuki Yamashita himself continued to resist until September. But the psychological effect of hearing Japanese voices speaking calmly from Allied broadcasts could not be undone. Captured diaries later found in the hills showed soldiers debating whether the voices were genuine or some enemy trick. Many noted the detail that only a true Japanese could know: the cadence of certain dialects, references to school songs or local idioms. "If they are still alive, perhaps we can live too," one wrote before surrendering. American intelligence measured the change not in sentiment, but in numbers. Between January and August 1945, over 35,000 Japanese soldiers surrendered in the Philippines alone, a staggering increase compared to earlier years when entire divisions had perished rather than yield. The work of men like Inoue had turned words into weapons more potent than bullets. For the first time since 1941, the idea of survival no longer belonged only to the enemy. At night, after the day's translations, Inoue would sit outside the barracks and write in his small notebook by lantern light. He recorded not military data, but observations of human nature: the Filipino children who sold bananas through the wire, the American guard who gave cigarettes to prisoners, the sick men who shared rations with each other. He reflected that this quiet decency, not the machinery, not the firebombs, was what truly ended empires. In one entry, dated May 14, 1945, he wrote, "We believed we could remake the world by discipline. These men remake it by kindness." When news reached the camp that Germany had surrendered in Europe, the POWs, Americans held a brief ceremony. A band played. Prisoners watched in silence. Some cheered softly. For Inoue, it was proof that wars built on supremacy always end in the same way: starved, surrounded, forgotten by those who promised glory. He wondered what would remain of Japan when its own surrender came. The answer, he thought, depended on whether men like him could carry back not humiliation, but understanding. The task was no longer to point for the emperor, but to prepare the survivors to live in a world rebuilt by those they had once despised. That was the quiet revolution beginning behind barbed wire at Bilibid. Not of weapons, but of minds. June 1945, Luzon. The thunder of artillery had faded from the hills, replaced by the dull clatter of construction and the low hum of generators that never slept. In the Bilibid compound, Lieutenant Kenji Inoue now lived among over 15,000 prisoners, most of them soldiers captured in the final sweep through northern Luzon. The Americans called it rehabilitation, though to Inoue it felt more like reawakening. The camp had expanded into an ordered city of wood and wire. Within its fences stood classrooms built from salvaged timber, each one filled daily with rows of gaunt men listening as Allied instructors, often Nisei linguists, taught lessons on world geography, democratic government, and science. Loudspeakers played recordings of Emperor Hirohito's pre-war radio addresses, followed by lectures on how the war had isolated Japan from progress. Inoue, working under the psychological warfare branch, was asked to moderate small discussion groups among officers. It was delicate work. The goal was not to humiliate, but to persuade. The Americans had learned through trial that shame closed minds faster than bullets. They wanted the prisoners to draw their own conclusions, to realize that Japan's defeat was not only military, but ideological. "Show them facts," his superior, Captain Harold Green, told him one morning. "Factories, ships, radios, education. Let them see what a free system builds when people can question orders." That afternoon, Inoue addressed 20 former officers seated cross-legged in the mess hall. He began quietly, recalling the rice ration in New Guinea, half a cup per day, and the endless slogans about spiritual victory. Then he described what he had seen since captivity: the Liberty ships built in days, the roads paved by machines rather than men, the hospitals where enemies and allies received equal treatment. The officers listened without interruption. Some stared at the floor, others clenched fists. Finally one, a major from Kyushu, broke the silence. "If what you say is true," he muttered, "then what did we die for?" Inoue paused before answering. "We died for a dream that could not feed us," he said, "but we can live for something real." It was not rhetoric. It was exhaustion turned into reason. He saw in their eyes the beginning of what he had once felt, the slow crumble of a wall built on pride. That night, he wrote in his diary, "When a man accepts that the truth is larger than his orders, he ceases to be a soldier and becomes human again." Outside the fences, the world itself was changing at breathtaking speed. In June, Allied submarines strangled Japan's sea lanes. Merchant shipping had fallen from 6 million tons in 1941 to barely 1 million still afloat. American bombers from the Marianas now reached every industrial city on the home islands. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Yokohama, all reduced to scorched plains. Inoue read the intercepted reports that crossed his desk and felt an ache deeper than defeat. His country was not merely losing a war, it was disintegrating under the weight of modernity it had refused to understand. Inside the camp, however, the opposite happened. The Japanese prisoners began to rebuild themselves. Workshops opened where carpenters, engineers, and tailors repaired equipment for the Allied bases. A small theater troupe formed, staging plays about rural life before the war. The Americans allowed them to broadcast short radio dramas for other camps. One script, which Inoue helped write, told the story of a fisherman returning to find his village destroyed, who chooses to rebuild rather than mourn. It was simple but powerful. In a war where propaganda had glorified annihilation, The idea of rebuilding itself became revolutionary. In August, the first whispers of an unimaginable weapon reached the compound. Guards talked of a single bomb that had destroyed an entire city. Hiroshima, August 6th, they said. 3 days later, Nagasaki. The prisoners listened to rumors through the fence like men hearing legends. When confirmation arrived by radio, hundreds of thousands dead in 2 blinding flashes, the camp fell silent. Inoue could not speak for hours. He had grown up reading about the divine winds that saved Japan from Mongol invasion. Now it seemed a man-made wind had ended an empire. On August 15, 1945, the prisoners gathered before the loudspeaker as the recorded voice of Emperor Hirohito, trembling and distant, announced Japan's surrender. The Americans stood motionless. The Japanese bowed their heads. Some wept quietly. Inoue felt neither relief nor despair, only a strange stillness. After years of blood and noise, silence itself seemed unreal. That evening, he walked alone to the edge of the wire and looked toward the Pacific. The sea was calm, its surface golden under the setting sun. "So it ends," he wrote in his diary. "Not by the sword, but by the world itself turning faster than we could follow." September 1945, Manila Harbor. The rain had stopped, and the air shimmered with the smell of salt and diesel as Liberty ships waited offshore, their decks crowded with soldiers preparing for the long voyage home. The war was over. Lieutenant Kenji Inoue stood among hundreds of Japanese prisoners lined up on the pier, each carrying a small canvas bag with everything they owned: uniform, ration tin, diary, and a letter of safe passage stamped by the U.S. Army. The white flags that had once meant surrender now fluttered from the ship rails as symbols of release. American officers moved through the lines checking manifests, their efficiency as precise as ever. When Inoue's name was called, he saluted, not from obedience but from gratitude. The camp commander, Colonel Stephen Hargrove, shook his hand and said, "You did more for peace than you'll ever know, Lieutenant." The words embarrassed him, but he understood. The surrender leaflets, the radio messages, the re-education lectures, these had not been mere propaganda. They had been bridges, built quietly between 2 civilizations that had spent years trying to annihilate each other. The voyage back to Japan took 15 days. The ship crossed the South China Sea, then curved north through the East China Sea, under skies that alternated between monsoon gray and brilliant blue. On deck, the prisoners were allowed to walk, talk, and gaze at the horizon. They shared cigarettes with American sailors, some of whom had fought at Okinawa or Leyte. There was no hatred now, only a weary recognition of shared endurance. Inoue spent the days writing his final reports at the request of U.S. intelligence, an account of Japanese soldier psychology, discipline, and the process by which surrender had become possible. He wrote that the change had not come from defeat alone, but from confrontation with a system that treated enemies as human beings. "The Americans broke our faith in death by showing us life," he wrote. "They proved that mercy, when practiced without weakness, is the greatest weapon in war." At night, when the deck was quiet, he looked up at the stars and thought of the millions who would never see them again. The soldiers buried under coral reefs, the civilians burned in Tokyo, the children buried under Hiroshima's ash. He wondered if any of it could be redeemed, or if redemption was only a word nations used to soothe their guilt. On September 20th, the ship entered Tokyo Bay. The scene before them was a vision from another world. The great gray hulls of American battleships floated beside ruined Japanese freighters. Cranes moved across the skyline, lifting debris from docks that had been reduced to skeletons. In the distance, Mount Fuji rose, serene and untouched, above a landscape of ruin. For many prisoners, the sight of home brought tears. For Inoue, it brought silence. Japan's cities lay in ruins, its people starved, its factories silent. Yet amid the destruction, something astonishing was already beginning. American engineers were clearing rubble from Yokohama docks. Railway workers, once soldiers, repaired tracks under U.S. supervision. Women in tattered kimonos carried bricks to rebuilding sites. The country, like the prisoners who returned, was awakening from a long fever. At the disembarkation center, each man received a food parcel and a small slip of paper reading "Repatriated Soldier, Work for Japan's Recovery." It was more than a document. It was an idea, a quiet command to rebuild instead of mourn. Inoue stepped onto the quay and inhaled the air of his homeland for the first time in 4 years. Around him, men bowed toward the ruins of the Imperial Palace in ritual silence. He thought of everything that had happened since he left. New Guinea, Hollandia, Dulag, Bilibid, the voices on the radio, the white flags on the pier. The war had begun with faith in the sword and ended with faith in survival. It had destroyed an empire, yet in its ashes lay the blueprint of a new world, a Japan that could learn not by conquest, but by creation. Inoue understood that his country's true resurrection would not come from generals or politicians, but from the quiet millions who had seen the futility of hate. They would teach their children what he had learned in captivity. That strength was not obedience, but understanding. He walked away from the harbor carrying nothing but a thin notebook, a memory of kindness from enemies, and the knowledge that he had witnessed the day when Japan's war became obsolete. Not in surrender, but in the simple act of choosing to live. October 1945, Yokohama. The port was a forest of cranes again, though now they lifted not weapons but timber, cement, and sacks of rice. The occupation forces had turned the harbor into a laboratory of reconstruction. Every morning the sirens signaled the start of work as thousands of laborers, Japanese civilians, repatriated soldiers, and Allied engineers moved through clouds of dust and steam. Lieutenant Kenji Inoue had been assigned to the newly formed Civil Information and Education section under the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. His task was translation and liaison, helping to prepare pamphlets explaining the principles of the new constitution, soon to come. It was strange work for a man who had once translated orders for war. The papers he now handled spoke not of loyalty to the emperor or sacrifice for the state, but of freedom of speech, the rights of women, and the rule of law. When he read the words aloud for the first time, "Sovereignty resides with the people," he felt a shiver. It was the opposite of everything his military education had taught him, and yet it carried a moral power that no command voice had ever achieved. He remembered Colonel Hargrove's words on the pier, "You did more for peace than you'll ever know." Perhaps this was what he meant. Peace was not the silence after victory, but the long discipline of rebuilding one's soul. Each evening, Inoue walked through the ruins of Yokohama. The streets were filled with sounds that had vanished during the war. Laughter, hammers striking metal, the cries of vendors selling fish and vegetables under makeshift stalls. The black market flourished beside American aid kitchens where children lined up for powdered milk. Above them hung banners printed with slogans in both Japanese and English. "Work for peace," "Rebuild Japan," "Democracy is strength." It would have been easy to dismiss them as propaganda, yet Inoue knew from experience that even propaganda could become truth when people believed in it long enough. In a small tea shop built from scrap lumber, he sometimes met other former officers. They spoke quietly of what they had seen in captivity: the electricity, the factories, the American farms. One man, a former pilot, said, "They won because they built instead of worshipped." Another replied, "Then perhaps we must learn to build our gods differently." The conversations were sober, but they carried a fragile optimism. For the first time, Japan's future seemed to depend not on conquest, but on comprehension. By winter, snow fell on the rubble of Tokyo. Families melted it for water, cooked barley soup over charcoal stoves, and listened to the crackling radios that had once blared imperial orders but now carried news of rice harvests and reconstruction plans. Inoue spent the holidays working in an office above what had once been a naval warehouse, translating Allied directives into simple Japanese. His English had improved through months of cooperation with American officers, many of whom treated him as an equal now. They shared cigarettes, talked about baseball, and sometimes lent him books: Steinbeck, Lincoln's speeches, even volumes of philosophy. Inoue devoured them, astonished by the tone of open disagreement that marked democratic writing. In Japan, he realized, unity had been forced through silence. In America, unity seemed to grow from argument. That paradox became his new study. In February 1946, he was invited to give a talk to a small gathering of Japanese teachers in Kanagawa. Standing before the group, he spoke not as an officer or a translator, but as a witness. "I once believed that duty meant never questioning orders," he said. "But the war taught me that true duty begins when we question what we are ordered to do." His audience sat in stillness, the only sound the crackle of the kerosene heater. Then an elderly teacher rose and bowed deeply. "Perhaps," she said, "that is the lesson our children must learn first." As spring approached, Inoue visited a hillside overlooking the city. Cherry trees that had somehow survived the bombings were beginning to bloom again. Below, he could see the harbor cranes lifting supplies from ships flying the same flags that had once brought invasion. He realized that the transformation unfolding around him was not merely political or economic. It was moral. Japan's surrender had become an education, and its prisoners had been the first students. What he and thousands like him had learned in the camps of the Philippines, the power of mercy, the dignity of labor, the futility of blind faith, was now shaping the rebirth of their country. Inoue opened his old notebook, its pages weathered and stained, and wrote his final entry. "We learned that obedience makes war and understanding ends it. We learned that freedom is not chaos, but the discipline to choose compassion. The war became obsolete when we stopped believing that death was duty and saw that life itself was responsibility." He closed the book, watched the petals drift on the wind, and understood at last that history's greatest revolutions are often quiet. They begin not with a gunshot, but with a moment of recognition. One soldier, one afternoon, realizing that survival is the highest form of courage.